Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us here at the Center for Geopolitics. When I first started my PhD some time ago on manufacturing and global trade in the early modern period, the relationship between globalization and the study of geopolitics was pretty tangential. There were people looking at it, there were people doing things on it, but it wasn't essential. That has very much changed, and we at the Center for Geopolitics have changed with it. And one of my tasks here is to work with Professor Sims, who founded our center, and others to work on economic statecraft and economic issues. And this event forms part of that, and we are delighted to be joined by someone who has really sought to address and engage with these questions. Elisabeth Braw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council focused on geopolitics and the globalized economy, as well as new security threats. She's also a columnist for foreign policy and Politico Europe. Elisabeth was previously a senior fellow at the AEI and a senior research fellow at RUSI in London. She's the author of God's Spies About the Stasi's Church Division, The Defender's Dilemma, Identifying and Deterring Grey Zone Aggression, and, importantly, this, Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World, which is now out with Yale University Press. I have now read it. It's a fantastically engaging read that I think does extremely well at capturing a feeling and a moment that many in the national security circles are now in and are now wrestling with it. It is available in all good bookstores, I'm sure. There will also be a discount link at the end of this, so you can buy a copy. I hope Yale will be happy with my sales pitch there. Okay, so we're going to do this as a conversation for a bit. We're going to talk about the book, and then we will open things up to questions. The chat function is disabled, but the Q&A function is live. So if people have questions, we'll try and get into those after about 45 minutes or so. I mean, I suppose the obvious place to start, really, Elisabeth, is your rationale for the book and what made you want to write it specifically now.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Hugo, and thank you for that brilliant introduction. And as you say, for many years, geopolitics was not something that people in the business community concern themselves with, and vice versa. And now the two have met, and it's not a pleasant meeting. And that's when I got interested, why I got interested in this. And it started around 2015, 2016, when I was in the private sector, and people in the business community started saying, well, something's changing in Russia, something's changing in China. It's not just the usual hiccups that any business experiences in any non-Western market. And so then I started thinking about what is it. I started looking at what it was that was changing, and since then, those changes that were essentially early indicators of a more fundamental shift, those changes and that growing feeling of uncertainty and almost hostility in the key markets of the post-Cold War globalized economy, that has only accelerated. In fact, it has accelerated to the point that everybody is talking about it now, and that acceleration has sped up enormously in just the past couple of years when I've been writing the book. And as we speak, Olaf Scholz is in China with a German business delegation. 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that sort of visit would not have been notable in any way, or let alone controversial. Now it is notable because so few Western leaders go to China anymore, and even if they wanted to, they would think twice about going because it would give them such bad press. And now he is there, accompanied by a business delegation, and he is getting predictably bad press and attention because people are saying, well, this moment is over. So that's why I started thinking about writing the book. I felt that this is a fundamental change. It's not just the usual hiccup that or bump on the road that globalized businesses get in foreign markets. There is something that's fundamentally changing, and then we can talk about other things that were changing around the same time, in addition to the decreasing hospitability in those two crown jewel markets.
Sure. There's a couple of questions that flow from that, but one is, what is the definition of globalization? I'm an economic historian. We have many different definitions. My favorite is Jan de Vries, who talks about hard and soft globalization, where hard globalization is just market integration across distance, and then you have a wider concept of soft globalization around the exchange of ideas and products and fashions and you name it. But I'd be curious, what is your definition, if you had to sort of boil it down to a sentence or few, of globalization?
It is trade around and across almost the whole world, based not just on the exchange of goods and services, but some minimal degree of shared values and ideals. And that's what we thought we saw after the end of the Cold War.
Sure. And actually, that works well. And I want to get back to the shared values point later on. And at the start of your book, you describe globalization as not a process, but as a decision. And you talk about how it was an active approach. And what I'd like to, ask it kind of that naturally follows from that is, who made the decision? What group of individuals, what group of states took the decision to embrace market integration across distance and to do so globally on the basis, as you put it, of some kind of shared value?
It was, I think, interestingly and crucially, it was people on both sides of this globalization aisle, as it were. It was Western politicians and Western business people, but also people, policymakers in the countries that wanted to join the Western market, as it were. So it wasn't just Western countries saying, oh, look, those countries are suddenly available because they've cast off, as in the case of countries behind the Iron Curtain, they've cast off their communist regimes. Now let's go and evangelize. They wanted to become liberal democracies. They wanted to become market economies. And similarly in China, where the integration started before the end of the Cold War, when policymakers, well, I should say the regime, decided that the best way to stay in power was to increase living standards. There, it wasn't, as we all know, it wasn't a decision to become like the West. It was just a decision to introduce some degree of capitalism in order to improve the economy and make improve people's lives, so that they wouldn't rise up in the manner that then happened behind the Iron Curtain. So it was a decision for completely different reasons by policymakers in the West, policymakers in what used to be the second world, and business people in the West. And I think what's interesting is that it wasn't some sort of ideology, and that's why I think, when Trump talks about globalism, he does it because he thinks it's bad, and if you call something an ism, you can discredit the people involved with it. But it really wasn't an ideology. It was just an opportunity that was available, and so many people wanted to be part of it. And if you look at the results, it worked out really well. But I think, and we can talk about where it started going wrong, but when some people started getting, some countries, policymakers, business leaders, when they started getting into it, it was almost as if it was a sort of a catch-up game for everybody else. So if German politicians started taking delegations to China, then if you're Italy, you said, well, we got to bring delegations to China too. And if Volkswagen went to China, as it did very early on, then if you're an automotive manufacturer, you said, well, I have to keep up with my competitor Volkswagen. So it was also a little bit of envy, I think, in competition from that point of view. It wasn't as if everybody said, sure, oh, this is a jolly good idea, I'll do the same.
I think that's interesting. One of the things we'll get onto is when this started and what the process was. But as one goes through this book, there's a pretty heavy focus on telecommunications and electronics, which forms actually a theme that runs through that. And part of that, I think, is that you're someone who knows the Scandinavian countries very well. And so Nokia and Ericsson kind of run through the book as well, including actually Nortel as well, a Canadian company that I know very well, and which met a rather grisly end. But I think that the telecommunications focus is really interesting because it's a sector that is closely tied to China in particular, and it then becomes such a touch point around Huawei and Huawei's participation. So I wanted to ask you why you chose to make telecommunications and personal electronics such a big focus within the book, and what you think that does to any account of globalization.
Well, I wanted lively stories, and the showdown between Huawei and the West, or China and the West, as played out in the case of Huawei, was a dramatic story, just as Nord Stream was a dramatic story too. So those two stories are I think the most dramatic showdowns in as globalization collided with geopolitics in the past couple of years. But also when it comes to Huawei, telecommunications, the digital revolution, that has accompanied globalization over these past 3.5 decades. And I don't know how many people on this call are under the age of 35, but those of us who are will remember the years, the previous era that included no smartphones and indeed no digital telecommunications. And it is really an extraordinary coincidence that the digital revolution, the mobile telecoms revolution, took off at the same time as this most recent round of globalization, which is also the most complete round to date. Somebody said to me the other day, well, the Roman Empire was globalized. Yes, it was, but it didn't cover the whole globe. So it was globalized within its own confines. But it really is extraordinary how the digital revolution, the mobile telecoms revolution, coincided with this round of globalization. And you can say that the two enabled, each enabled the other. And Huawei is such, I think, an illustrative example from that perspective, and it illustrates China's rise as part of this round of globalization, and also the problems that became more and more evident through the years as China's rise continued. And so if we look at Huawei, when Ericsson entered China in the 80s and early 90s, Huawei was a nothing company. And the way, as you know, Hugo, and probably many others on the call, the way it worked was if you wanted to enter China as a Western company, you had to make concessions. So you had to sign a cross-licensing agreement or a joint venture agreement, and that was essentially your concession for the opportunity to be able to enter this extraordinary market. And that's what Ericsson did. They signed a cross-licensing agreement, and then you may ask, well, what's in it for them in the late 80s, early 90s? Cross-licensing with Huawei. Ericsson had massive amounts of IP. Huawei was a tiny company that had almost no IP. So what's in it for Ericsson? Well, from Ericsson's perspective, it was what you had to do, even though they got nothing out of it. And it was fine for many years because Ericsson got to be on this amazing market, got to manufacture, sell in this just the most attractive country there was as the world globalized. And it didn't matter that much that they had to relinquish IP to Huawei. But then when do you reach the point where you say, well, now our competitor that we are giving, the company that we're giving IP to, relinquishing IP to, now has reached the size and the sophistication where we can no longer afford this act of charity, I think you could call it. And at some point that point did arrive. And I think probably policymakers realized too late that China had reached the point where its companies were extremely competitive on their own steam vis-a-vis the companies from which they had been benefiting. And that's why this became such a sort of a showdown between the US and China, because the US wanted to do something about globalization, and they felt Huawei was the best example of why globalization, the way we set it up, wasn't working anymore.
I think it's interesting. By the way, whoever told you that the Roman Empire was an example of globalization needs to speak to some more economic historians, because I'm not buying that one. Early globalization is a really complicated question. I would argue there is a degree of globalization in the late 17th to mid 18th century, but generally the first wave of globalization, as I'm sure you know, is conceived of as the late 19th to early 20th centuries. And that's the real jump in global trade as a share of GDP. And of course is also associated very clearly with a revolution in telecommunications, whether you're looking at the telegraph, subsea cables, or all that stuff, which I think is an ever relevant aspect of these conversations, is the technological advance. I do want to talk about this issue of IP, though, because it's another big theme of your book, is that the great threat of China comes from IP theft. And there's an interesting distinction we need to make, I think, between IP theft at a company level and IP loss at a national level. If we look at Huawei, the sort of four companies that run through this, so Nortel, Huawei, Nokia, and Ericsson, who were the four big telecommunications companies you talk about a bit in the book. Actually, two of those are relying on UK IP they purchased. So Nortel takes over STC, and with it a huge amount of fiber optic skill. Ericsson, of course, buys Marconi, and with it a huge amount of UK IP. Now that's globalization too, and from a UK perspective, you might say that had a huge cost, right, in terms of IP loss. But that's not what you're talking about. What you're talking about is China acting as a rogue state, if you like, and breaking the rules of IP theft through IP theft. And so what is from a national perspective the real danger in IP theft, and why do you put such a heavy weight on it when considering China's role?
Yeah, so there has always been IP theft, and there's this famous letter from Alexander Hamilton, I think it is, who wrote to a compatriot that he had to get all the secrets from the British weaving industry, textile industry.
Oh, I could talk about that one for hours. Yeah.
Yes, please do. But so this is nothing new, and at the company level, it's also nothing new. I mean, companies operate on the basis that either their employees are could decide to steal IP, or a competitor could decide to steal IP through various means. But I think why this matters so much in the case of China is that it was the first example of where a country decided that its rise to economic prominence was going to, and it was going to be conducted much faster than the sort of organic rise that one could expect from a country like China. And it was going to be conducted or be executed much faster on the basis of a very rapid acquisition of IP. And some of it was legal. Those cross-licensing deals were completely legal. And you could say those Western companies signed them eyes open, and there was nothing illegal about what China did. But that was just one part. The other part was the illegal acquisition of IP, and not just from companies, and Nortel was one of those companies, but many other Western companies as well, manufacturers, technology companies, and it was Chinese firms, but also Chinese intelligence agencies. And then we get into the really tricky area of IP loss at universities and labs, and that was part of that strategy. And you can say brilliantly executed by the Chinese authorities. They took full advantage of the opportunities afforded to China through globalization, especially after China entered the World Trade Organization. And if you want to play a little bit of a dirty game, you know, the others should be better at defending themselves. But that's why I think you can we can conclude that China has executed a very rapid rise because it decided that IP was going to be getting IP was going to be its core objective, and that makes it so difficult, I think, from a Western perspective to think about, well, how do we protect ourselves while remaining globalized? We can't protect ourselves. IP it crosses borders and indeed crosses brains on a daily basis. How do we protect ourselves against that? If a country has decided that it's going to systematically acquire IP. It was interesting when I did a talk the other day. A woman came up to me afterwards, a petite woman who I hadn't actually noticed in the room, and she said, "Well, that was a very interesting talk, and I was fascinated to hear your perspective." And then she handed me her business card, and she is the defense attaché of China in the UK at the rank of Major General. So it's just to say that obviously the Chinese government will have a completely different perspective. And this is also the story of globalization. We in the West have one perspective on it, and China, Russia, other countries may have a completely different perspective, and both are equally true because we have experienced the same process from two different sides. And I'm sure any Chinese government representative who may be on this call would say, well, you know, this is how it works. You didn't protect yourselves well enough, and here we are.
Indeed. And I think it's certainly striking they turned up to your talk. That's both interesting and has given you a glorious thing to talk about at future talks, for which I'm sure you're very grateful. I'm a historian myself, and it would be wrong if I didn't push back a little bit. And there's three areas I'd like to dive into a bit more closely now. And the first is when disaggregating two things that are very separate. We got into it a bit in terms of IP loss, which is the integration of markets globally and free trade in general on the one hand, and the specific actions of China and Russia as rogue states that have broken rules, norms, and values on the other. You talk a lot in the book about an English town called Smethwick, which is very familiar to students of British politics. Sadly, for very unfortunate reasons, actually, and people who are interested can look into that. But I thought I would go into a bit of a deep dive on Smethwick because I was curious to see where we go with this. And of course, Smethwick, if you look at its sector employment breakdown, has three real areas of manufacturing focus. The overwhelming one is auto, right? Is the auto industry in Birmingham and the wider area, with employment in West Bromwich and at Longbridge and at all of these great centres of English manufacturing. You then historically have ironworks to a large extent, and some locomotive industry, though that went very, very early on. And then you have services and retail, that outside, and sort of services, drinks manufacturing actually a bit. If we look at UK employment in manufacturing, it reaches its height in 1966, and this is all from the ONS, when it's about 40% of the population. When Britain joins the EEC, as it was then, it was 36%. By the time we get to 1990, 89, 90, around the time your book starts, it's already dropped to 25. And by 2001, when China joins the WTO, it's below 20. And if you look at Smethwick, which is a town you come back to in the book, the job losses in the manufacturing sector are real, but they're mostly in terms of competition to Germany, France, and Japan. And actually, if we look at many of the conversations that are taking place in America now, they have their origins in the debate over Japan and the role of Japan in the global economy.
And that's what got Trump interested in politics in the first place.
Exactly. So we have these two things in terms of Russia and China, and you talk a lot about Russia in the book, I think rightly, and we'll get on to Nord Stream, I think, in a sec, and I know Brendan has some questions on that score. But the issue with Russia and China is that they are rogue states that don't obey the rules. That's not globalization quite. Globalization in the integration of markets can take place even among states that do obey some version of the rule. I mean, we can talk about Japanese currency issues, or even German, but in general, like these are rule-obeying states. And that is the origin of many of the globalization debates. In the UK, it's closely tied to EU membership, obviously. So should we disaggregate these two things, or should we see them as the same thing? That's the question I would ask.
Well, I think after the end of the Cold War, and it's annoying when people start any sentence with after the end of the Cold War, but there was this idea that we're all becoming the same, we're becoming similar, if not already the same, then in the process of becoming more similar, having more shared values. I think globalization as a sort of totally dispassionate and pragmatic process, just based on trade and the circulation of goods and services, would have been possible without that emotional component or that ideological or values-based component. But it seemed at the time that we were at some sort of inflection point where we were all bearing the hatchet, and our countries were becoming more alike. So that emotional or values-based component somehow snuck into the process of globalization and became a much more intense process than it would have needed to be. It's a little bit like it was a love affair when it should have been a business relationship. And as a result, we in the West, I think, expected more of our trading partners, because we wanted them to become, we just assumed they would become more like us, and were then disappointed when they didn't. Whereas if we'd gone into this based on an assumption that globalization would just be a commercial transaction, and we wouldn't have any feelings involved, and we wouldn't have been so disappointed when it started, when some things started turning sour. That doesn't change the fact that for businesses, when geopolitics enters the equation, for businesses, it doesn't matter whether emotions are involved or not. They have to make a decision then whether to keep operating in that country. But nevertheless, I think it was because it was such a love affair or romance, it then became much more bitter than it would have needed to be if we just went into it thinking that, oh, we're going to trade goods and services back and forth.
I mean, it's funny you should say that. I thought I'd bring up George W. Bush's statement on China's accession to the WTO, and like many others, you highlight 2001 as the key year, both obviously through 9/11, but also through China's accession. I just thought I'd read this. I am confident that China's entry into the WTO, said George W. Bush, will bring other benefits to China beyond the expected economic benefits. WTO membership, for example, will require China to strengthen rule of law and introduce certain civil reforms, such as the publication of rules, which actually did happen, but in a complicated way. In the long term, an open, rules-based Chinese economy will be an important underpinning for Chinese democratic norms. So those instincts and those feelings were absolutely there, but they sat on alongside an absolutely extraordinary transformation in living standards brought about by globalization. And the easiest way to see this with regard to China specifically is to go back to consumer electronics, which is why the presence of them in your book is I think so right. And if we look at that, and I just went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics to just get the numbers right. If we take December 1997 as 100, right, as our starting point, and then look at the cost of consumer electronics but in December 2008, in televisions they've dropped by 80% in real terms, computer software by half, and in personal computers and peripheral equipment, they're down 92%. So you had this extraordinary drop, and a lot of that is China. Which leads me to my question. Wasn't the value judgment aspect of it just a cover? How sincere, and can we separate out the sincerity of the values-based aspect of it relative to the economic benefits? And relatedly, is it right to see those economic benefits in terms of companies, or should we be focused much more on the consumer side?
Well, I think we should remember, first of all, that this is not some sort of comprehensive move by a Western elite to take a particular decision. It just happened, and yes, they did meet in Davos, but it was it was less coordinated than one might think. It was just the opportunities were there. Western policymakers created additional opportunities for Western companies to be able to expand to various countries, including China. And off they went and did it in different ways. And they were keen to make it happen. In fact, they were desperate to make it happen. When do you ever get an opportunity like this? And it's also just, I think, useful to remember what a time it was to be alive in the late 80s, especially early 90s. The late 80s obviously brought China, and then a number of countries in Latin America, and then they were joined in the early 90s by the countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain. And business people are used to one market opening, and all of a sudden you had this extraordinary number of markets, and not just one maybe 10 million people country at a time, but massive countries, which is why China and Russia are so important. And now, actually, Hugo, I can't remember your question, but I just wanted to issue a reminder of what you need.
So the question was focused on the extent to which the values aspect of it was sincerely held, and I think your argument is that it was sincerely held, and that it was a fundamental part of it.
It was sincerely held on the part of policymakers. Business people, as you know, are completely dispassionate and go where the opportunities take them. But one aspect, really important aspect, I think, of the values, since you mentioned them, is the fact that in China, it wasn't, or in all these other countries, it wasn't just a matter of going there to do business. It was a matter of going there and teaching the local elite and others how to operate a market economy, right, and how to set up a market economy. So on that basis, it was a values-based proposition, and not just proposition, but execution. And it really is extraordinary to think now that bankers who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s, Western bankers, are the ones who set up, for example, the financial system of China. Now they are no longer needed because the local bankers and officials know how to operate a capitalist system in financial services and indeed every other area.
And that brings me to the country that doesn't feature so strongly in your book, which is India. And we have Russia and China, which are these two fundamental business partners of Western countries like mine and yours over the 90s to early noughties. And if you look at what China is doing, a lot of it is offshore manufacturing, and it plays a vital role in that process, and has just sort of increased its share of manufacturing value add. Russia is both a market and a partner in energy and raw materials. India is IT, right? And if you look at IT services and many other aspects of that, the huge offshoring, as we in the UK are now very familiar with through our Prime Minister, brought enormous profits to India and completely changed its economy. So when we think about India, where does it fit into your story? And where can it go?
It fits into my story because it was a prospective globalization winner in the 80s and especially 90s, and still is, but it was always the runner-up to China. Yes, it did spectacularly well in some areas, including technology, but China did well in every area: manufacturing, financial services, technology, all kinds of technology, from life sciences to telecommunications. China did everything so well, and the reason it did everything so well is, I think one can argue that it's an authoritarian system where the government can decide this is what we're going to do, and then it happens. And in a democracy, especially a large and unwieldy one like India, it's much more difficult to make that happen. So you saw, and I think one of the protagonists of the book, because this is not a book about policy, it's a book about people, including the people who made some of the people who made this happen. And one of them is Michael Tresco, who was in the late 80s an executive with Atlas Copco. Then he became CEO of Atlas Copco, then CEO of Electrolux, then chairman of Ericsson, then chairman of Unilever. And he, for example, talks about how when he was CEO of Electrolux, he looked at Indian companies that he could acquire, because that was also part of this process, right? To acquire underperforming companies in these new markets and brought them into your constantly growing conglomerate, transform them, and then you built on their market and were able to improve the company you had just bought. But it wasn't. He looked at Indian companies to acquire and couldn't really find any good ones, and there wasn't really much else in the manufacturing sector that was very attractive. Whereas in China, you could, even if there were no good local companies, the proposition of manufacturing there and selling there was so strong anyway. So India did well and really well in some areas, but it wasn't that the whole package solution that China was. And I think, Hugo, if we may leap to the year 2024, that's why China's fading star power on the basis of geopolitics is, I think, such good news for India, because India is getting a second chance at becoming the top winner and a top destination of globalization, whatever the new version looks like. Who would have thought they would get that second chance of beating China to the top place on the podium?
And that's where I'd like to end our discussion, actually. But beforehand, you talked about characters. Well, one character that features pretty centrally in your story is Donald Trump, who obviously comes in. And as we've discussed, Donald Trump's been on this topic for a very, very long time, right? He begins in the 1980s as a critic of Japan and Japanese production. He's then closely tied to the Reform Party in the 1990s, in the good old days of Ross Perot and the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico under NAFTA. And so, in fact, opposition to free trade is one of the great consistencies through Donald Trump's career. And when he runs for president, his target is China. Was he effective in his response to China? I think you make a very strong case in the book that he wasn't particularly. But I suppose my two questions are, was his opposition to China values-based, which I don't think it can be given his close relationship simultaneously with President Putin? And was he effective in his response?
I think, Hugo, one can even doubt whether his opposition to China was sincere. I think his opposition to Japan was sincere in the 80s, and that's how he discovered that he wanted to get into politics. But then when he took on China, yes, there were structural flaws in globalization and the way China was taking advantage of globalization that he rightly pointed out. But I think it became essentially a vehicle for him to tap into certain parts of the electorate in America, an electorate that had been forgotten or essentially disregarded by other politicians and other parties. And that's what I hope I'm able to show in the book, that the opposition to globalization among so-called ordinary people never went away. In the 90s, they were told that, just get with the program, retrain for a different profession. But that resentment never went away. And you can say it was misguided, and that the giant sucking sound of jobs leaving for Mexico, and then here, well, in Europe, for Central and Eastern Europe, and then subsequently to China, that was, it was not so much that jobs went there as them becoming automated and there needing to be fewer jobs in the first place. But it's much easier to blame globalization than it is to blame automation. And then you or I or others can create charts that show that so and so many % of jobs have been lost to automation, so and so many jobs have been lost to China. But it's still easier to blame China than it is or Eastern Europe or Mexico than it is to blame automation. And Trump realized that. He realized there was this whole chunk of the population that felt resentful, not just because of material loss losses or a loss of jobs, but resentful over not, essentially as a result of not having been taken seriously by policymakers or by what they considered the elite. And on that note, if we could do globalization again, which we may get an opportunity to do, but if we could do it again, I think it's just so important for companies to realize that they have a social mandate as well as a commercial one. When in America they packed up and closed their factories, they didn't think about what would happen to jobs, to the people who were left behind. Same thing in Smethwick, and the reason I have Smethwick in the book is that I wanted to have John Speller, who is such a representative of the old-fashioned Labour Party, the sort of Labour Party that felt strongly about workers' rights and so forth. And then we got Tony Blair's Labour Party that felt very strongly about globalization and free trade and so forth. But those people, they will not go away. They will make their voices heard, and that's what Trump realized. Now, that's a very, very long way of coming around to your point, but if we get another chance of doing globalization, I think we have to remember, we have to bear in mind the so-called ordinary people, because they may not have a strong voice, but they will make their voice heard.
Well, I think it's an interesting way of putting it. Again with Smethwick, I think we're getting at a fundamental tension in our response to China, which is that, and this actually goes for Russia as well. When we're thinking about how to build that new globalization, we as a population of the UK, for example, are looking for reshored manufacturing, increased employment opportunities, and that kind of recentering, which for Britain is of course largely about European competition and then high-end competition, which is very much within the values-based block you outline in the conclusion of your book. When we are thinking about the China competition, and actually that's starting to change with BYD in Europe, as I'm sure we've all seen. If anyone goes to Germany, you get a nasty shock. But we have that tension between seeing our response to globalization in terms of, as you put it, ordinary people, and seeing it as a geopolitical response to China. Because if it's a geopolitical response to China, the countries we should be reaching out to are also countries with low wages, are also countries that are seeking to move up the value chain, are also countries that are seeking to establish and entrench certain rules-based norms that will facilitate offshoring. That indeed is the definition of the word friendshoring.
Yes.
So how do we square this?
It is a dilemma, and it really is extraordinary to see the various forces that have come together to essentially I don't want to say defeat globalization, but counter globalization. So it's so-called ordinary people at home who have found a voice, but it's also business people, companies that have discovered that Russia and China are much less hospitable places to do business, and it is Russia and China which, for different reasons, have decided that they don't particularly like this close embrace and the system that we built up starting in the early 90s. So Vladimir Putin decided that his top priority was not continuing to build prosperity for Russian citizens. His top priority was acquiring a chunk or all of Ukraine. And we can say, well, that's totally illogical. Why would he do that? Well, it doesn't matter whether it's illogical. That was his top priority. And for Xi Jinping, and I think this is something business leaders realized long before Western policymakers did, his top priority is also not increased prosperity for the Chinese people. It is to stay in power, and that's why he started cracking down on the private sector in China, both on Western companies, but then also extraordinarily on Chinese companies. And that's why the crackdown on Jack Ma was, I think, such a pivotal moment, because that's when he demonstrated that it's not his top priority is not increased prosperity for the Chinese population at any cost. It is remaining in power. And he cracked down on Jack Ma and Jack Ma's ilk because they had become too powerful.
All right, I want to get to questions from the audience. I have a few lined up in advance, but if people want to start thinking those through, that would be fantastic. And this is where I really want to end the conversation, which is on decoupling as a term, which we hear around a lot. We have partially succeeded in decoupling from Russia, and I would really emphasize the partially, right? Because a lot of large corporations pulled out, a lot of trade has declined, but Russia is still exporting that oil and it's still exporting that gas. So there has been, as you chart in the book actually, and you get it very coherently, a very clear decoupling there. There has not been a decoupling from China. And when we think about trade with China, it's important not to over-focus on big corporations. It's true that Apple are diversifying and one or two others, and this is one of, I think, the most important ways of understanding trade with China. Trade with China is very odd because a lot of it comes from small and medium-sized businesses. So if we look at import value to the United States, SME importers account for around 41% of imports from China, which is an incredibly high number. That dependency is increasing. In fact, even when under the Trump tariffs, the US deficit with China increased. They just priced in the tariff and moved. So my question is decoupling from China, not in the critical bits that we're doing now, but broad-based decoupling, possible? And if it is, what would do it? And when should it be done?
Well, it's not possible. First of all, our integration with China is now it's in its almost fifth decade. So from the 80s up until now, how are you going to undo that? It's like getting divorced. You don't just walk away from a 4-decade relationship and say,
I don't know. I think the voters of Britain would disagree with you on that one.
Good point. Well, it has been painful, and it's going to be even more painful to do the same with China, which we are so dependent on. But first of all, what has changed is not the level of trade, which, as you pointed out, is very strong still. It's the fact that people have lost faith in this whole system, and so we'll see a deterioration in the relationship, and then I think a gradual decline in trade. But and decoupling is not going to happen just because some policymakers, and especially not if think tankers say that it's necessary. It comes down to whether business people think that it makes financial business sense to relocate parts of their business from China to another country. And it's not going to be all of their business is going to be part of their business, because they will want to keep manufacturing and doing whatever the nature of their business is in China for the Chinese market. So they will clone themselves, and that cloning is going to be slow, because where can you clone yourself and do exactly the same things you've been doing in China? It's not easy to find that perfect alternative, and that's why this is a second opportunity for India. But India is not a complete answer, because it doesn't provide that whole package that China did even 4 decades ago. So it's going to be some sort of combination of India with a couple of regional allies, but they would have to build up logistics, infrastructure, transportation, and legal frameworks to harmonize all of that amongst themselves. Same thing maybe around Mexico and a couple of allies, a couple of neighbors in that neighborhood. That's going to be a long process, because none of that is in place at the moment. And it was interesting the other day, somebody from a major manufacturer came to me and said, well, couldn't you do a few events on new manufacturing hubs? What will they be? And so, yes, I will do that. But they don't just exist, which makes it so fascinating. Which countries will be able to seize this moment? But in the meantime, we will have this really close trading relationship with China, even though so many segments of our societies, and indeed Chinese society, have lost faith in the way it's set up. And just one aspect I think to bear in mind is just to illustrate the loss of faith in this in this version of globalization and the way it works at the moment. So companies need, if they operate outside Western countries, they need political risk insurance, and that covers everything from asset seizure, politically motivated asset seizure, to war. And many companies operating in China in recent years, up until recent years, I should say, have felt that they didn't need expensive political risk insurance in China because it was becoming quite safe, quite predictable, and so forth. Now they want that insurance, but at the same time, the underwriters who offer it are also becoming very concerned about China. So it's almost impossible to get political risk insurance for China, which tells you something about where globalization is.
Okay, we've had a huge conversation lasting a very long time and haven't even talked about green transition or AI, which I think is quite astonishing. But I'm going to stop talking, and we'll move across to questions. And beginning with one from Brendan that I think is very interesting, which is, given the difficulty you refer to of extracting different economic groups from Russia and especially the PRC, is the logical step not so much disengagement of big corporations, but rather distinct economic spaces in which VW and other corporations produce for the PRC, USA, and EU and reinvest profits locally? And he makes the comparison to Ford producing in both America and Germany in enduring World War II.
Yes, and that's what this what I consider a cloning process. That's what that will be about. I think we'll see, for example, or in fact, we're already seeing a company like L'Oreal operating in China for the Chinese market with Chinese managers, Chinese components, and essentially being a Chinese company. It's just that at the end of the day, the profits go back to Paris, but that's the extent of L'Oreal's Frenchness in China. And I think we'll see a very similar process with other companies, which not just, I think we're already beginning to see that happen. It's much easier if the product you make is shampoo than if the product you make is a smartphone. So it will take longer for the more sophisticated companies' products are. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is, if we want companies to friendshore and especially to return to Western countries, and so if we want Smethwick and the rest of the Midlands to be a manufacturing hub once again, then we have to have an honest discussion in our countries, in the UK and elsewhere, about who is going to work in these factories. It sounds great bringing the jobs back, but who are the people who will actually be taking these jobs on? We have had decades now of policymakers and teachers and other adults telling teenagers that the way for teenagers to have a good life is to go to university. And obviously we are here in a university setting, so I would never dream of criticizing academic pursuits. But if we are going to friendshore, if we're going to bring jobs back, and these are going to be sophisticated jobs, factory jobs today are much more sophisticated than when they left, who is going to be taking on these jobs? And I think we need to have an honest conversation about the fact that more people, more teenagers, other young people, indeed people of all ages, need to be open to the prospect of returning or joining the manufacturing sector and other jobs, take on other jobs that may be returning. Shipbuilding is such a sector that is much in discussion, but no, we are not going to build any ships in the UK if we don't have any workers to build them. So that's one aspect of what needs to happen. So Brendan, coming back to your question, the cloning will involve I think we'll have to involve a very transparent and open conversation by policymakers and indeed across society about the fact that if we are going to make more products at home, somebody will need to make them, and who is that going to be? We're already seeing an early example of that in Arizona, which has been such a masterful case, masterful has executed friendshoring so masterfully. The state of Arizona, the chambers of commerce, Arizona State University, and the private sector have brought so much investment in the chip manufacturing sector to Arizona, and now they are struggling because they don't have enough workers. So I'm not trying to sound like some sort of old-fashioned Marxist here to say, saying more power to the workers, but really we are not going to be able to execute friendshoring or reshoring without workers.
Okay, 2 questions from Domenica Lewis. I hope we get to both of them. The first is on the future of the WTO and what the future of the international trading system and the WTO will look like if the world splits further.
Yeah, I heard the WTO Secretary General on the radio the other day, and she made a compelling case for the WTO. But I think the people who need to be convinced are, well done her for trying to convince radio listeners, but the people who need to be convinced are governments, and this is where we are seeing a really dangerous deterioration around the world. The fact that the UN-based system that has served us so well, maybe not perfectly, but quite well since the late 40s, it's not going to work if we don't have a critical mass of countries signing up to it and then doing what they promised to do when they signed whatever the agreement is. And we're seeing it not just the erosion of global norms and the global institutions. We're seeing it not just in the WTO, but also in other areas. The global maritime order is in trouble because countries are not committed to upholding the commitments they made when they signed various maritime conventions. And that's why we have the situation that we have in the Red Sea, in the Strait of Hormuz, indeed in the Baltic Sea, which is closer to us because the shadow fleet, which powers the Russian economy, keeps sailing in and out of the Baltic Sea, and there is nothing really that any country can do about Russia's violations of various maritime rules and conventions in using that fleet. So coming back to the WTO, it can't save itself, and it's not for lack of trying. It's if we have that erosion of commitment to global conventions and rules, who is going to be the global police who's going to force it? We don't have that global police, and without the goodwill of a critical mass of the countries on this planet, those institutions are in a very precarious place, and it really is troubling to watch, especially because it's not just the WTO, it's institutions across and around the UN system.
I think it's worth saying that one of the main reasons the WTO is in crisis at the moment is that the US has blocked all appointments to the appellate body in order to support the enforcement of steel tariffs under the national security exemption that the WTO does not view as legal. And so we're in this space where there is a general concern, I think rightly, about the negative impacts of a push towards free trade that was not fully understood. But that's intersecting in interesting ways with a simultaneous move towards disregarding norms by Russia and, to a lesser extent, China that has its own response. That subject of disregarding norms gets me to Professor Sims's second question, which is perhaps somewhat blunter, which is who blew up Nord Stream 1? And does this change in any way your story? This is a conversation that we've had a few times here at the Center for Geopolitics, and we go backwards and forwards. So, Elisabeth, your view.
Yes, Nord Stream is a crucial part of the story. And I wanted to include Nord Stream because it was one of the most prominent examples of globalization. So Germany needed more energy to power its constantly growing economy, which was growing thanks to globalization. And what better way to do it than to import it from a country that used to be our foe and by that point was our friend. And Nord Stream, the company itself is as I think everybody on this call knows, majority owned by a Russian company, minority owned by Western European companies, and the pipelines themselves were built by a number of other companies. It was really a globalization masterpiece, and it also brought prosperity to this forgotten town of Lubmin on Germany's northeastern shore, which is one of those many towns around the Western world that have lost their major employer and thought that all hope was gone. And that is that sort of fate is what then brings votes to people like Trump, who say, well, I have an easy solution. But Lubmin escaped that woeful existence because it was decided that Nord Stream would come ashore there. And that's why I wanted to tell that story, because it brought hope, it brought prosperity, and it brought a future to the town of Lubmin. And you can say, well, it was hopelessly naive to try to think that Nord Stream would ever be a viable option, or a viable undertaking, because it had Russia in it. But at that point, for those involved, most of those involved, it seemed like a total win-win. And for the people in Lubmin, it was just an injection of hope that they hadn't thought would ever come their way, and doesn't ever come most little towns' way. And the people who were opposed to it were very few and far between, and that's why I started the book with the story of this local politician on the island of Gotland, which housed the logistics hub for Nord Stream 1 when it was being built. She opposed it and was called a Russophobe. And Professor Sims, with regard to who blew up Nord Stream, I have, because I'm not a subsea infrastructure engineer myself, I have spoken to subsea engineers for not just for this book, but also more widely. And the consensus is that it's impossible for a non-state actor to execute sabotage of this kind of sophistication. So it would be extremely unlikely for it to be any sort of terrorist group or any group that doesn't have the active involvement of a government. And then that leads us to the question of which government would benefit from Nord Stream being blown up. And I think that's where we are stuck. I have my theory, and I think you may have yours too. I think indeed everybody on this call may have their own theory. But what is interesting is that the Swedish and Danish investigators have concluded their investigations and haven't said who they think did it. And I think the reason for that is that they may have identified a perpetrator, at least a likely perpetrator, but since that perpetrator, for reasons just discussed, is likely to be a state, it would then put Sweden and Denmark in a very uncomfortable situation of having to retaliate against that state. So I think they may never present the findings of those investigations until we reach the next stage of globalization, when we're all friends again.
Nicely dodged. Okay. We have a question and a follow-up question on ESG, which I think gets us into a broader question highlighted by Nord Stream about the green transition. I'll follow up on ESG in a moment, but I think it's striking. Of course, Nord Stream was a step backwards for Germany in its green transition because it came hand in hand with a rejection of nuclear power. And you write about that in the book, and that was fundamental to what Nord Stream was. It was a source of cheap energy for German industry that didn't involve nuclear. When we think about energy and the green transition, so not the manufacturing side of things, which we can get to if there's time, but on energy and the green transition, energy production, do you see that as something that is going to accelerate the trends that you outline in your book, or something that's going to slow it down?
Energy production, you said.
Yeah. The move to greener energy production.
Yes. That is a really good question. And it links to the fact that Generation Z will have a say in all of this. And Generation Z has much stronger views. I don't know whether you belong to that generation.
I'm
Hugo.
afraid I just missed it, thankfully.
Okay. So then let's talk about them rather than me lecturing you about what your generation is like. But they, as I think is known to everybody on this call, have taken a much stronger view on what business should stand for, and the fact that businesses should have values, ideally the values that Generation Z's members themselves hold, and those values can be very different. I was talking to somebody the other day who is head of government affairs for a very large global company, and he said, my job is to handle government affairs, and all I do is put out geopolitical fires among our employees because they have such strong views on the positions that the company should take. So that's where we are today. Germany in particular will struggle with this, and the dilemma is we need to make ourselves less dependent on hostile or on unfriendly countries on their energy manufacturing and energy production, but we also don't want dirty energy production in our own countries, and the two clash. And I don't know what the answer is, except Generation Z and Green campaigners would say, but we should just consume less energy. That is the best energy strategy. One of the advantages of globalization has been that we can export inconvenient parts of the economy to other countries. But now if we want to make ourselves less dependent on those countries, especially China, we'll have to bring those aspects back to our own countries, and not just find workers who can take care of them, but also locations where they can take place. And that involves, for example, rare earth processing, but also energy production. And it starts with, I think we are getting a good understanding or good appreciation, painful appreciation of what's to come in the debate around wind turbines. If we are going to make ourselves less dependent in lots of ways on other countries, then wind turbines are a very small price to pay, and it is a luxury to be able to say, well, I don't want a wind turbine in my local area. But if already that gets people upset, imagine what sort of aggravated feelings we'll have if we bring all the other things back in energy and beyond that we will need to have in our countries in order to reduce our dependence.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing about wind turbines, of course, is a significant volume of the parts are manufactured in China.
Yes.
Which gets one to the other half, really, of ESG, which is the recent moves towards tax credits and support for green manufacturing and the manufacturing of component parts in energy production. The EU is moving its way towards that. The US has done it incredibly sharply and I think extremely effectively through the Inflation Reduction Act, which does reduce inflation a bit more than you said it does in your book, though I take the general point. And the UK is moving in that direction as well. These steps towards onshoring manufacturing, do you see them as specifically anti-Russia, anti-China measures? Or are they part of a conversation more broadly about free trade and market integration?
I think they started out as being about China, really, because we didn't have much manufacturing in Russia. But then they became about reshoring generally, and the Inflation Reduction Act really is an extraordinary piece of legislation. It's brilliant from an American perspective. It really is a win-win-win. Less dependent on China, more good manufacturing jobs in America, and green transition on top of all of that. What's not to like? Well, it is not good for America's closest friends. And frankly, Hugo, I think the Americans forgot the effect that this would have on America's closest friends when they were drafting this bill, because we are moving into such a selfish era that I never heard any debates or any concerns until the bill had been passed. I didn't hear about any bill, any concerns about the effect that this would have on America's closest friends, and the effect is right there for everybody to see. If you heavily incentivize companies to bring manufacturing to your country, they will come not just from a country like China. They will bring manufacturing not just from a country like China, but also from where they might have put it in Europe. They will instead bring it to America. And after the bill had been passed, it became obvious that this would be detrimental to European countries, because European companies started saying, well, we are going to bring manufacturing back from China, or we're going to clone our manufacturing that we have in China and create the clone not in Europe, but in a place like Arizona or South Carolina. And that's when it became obvious that, oh, maybe this was quite detrimental to America's allies. But it seems like the loss of faith in globalization has encouraged a bit of selfish thinking, and that is detrimental. We have to, I say we, policymakers within the Western world have to consult with business leaders within the Western world about how we can make sure that this doesn't become a sort of an atomization or a protectionism involving individual countries or benefiting just individual countries, but how we can work more closely together. And if I can just make one point there about the business elite, I wonder how today's CEOs and company chairmen and women will tackle all this. They have spent their whole career in the world that knew no borders, I should say, the other way around, knew no borders, and where borders became less and less important. Their own nationality didn't matter. Their company's nationality didn't matter. We have a global class of executives who can work anywhere and be at home anywhere. And now all of a sudden nationality matters again, maybe not so much their nationality, but their company's nationality. And that is a new world. And on top of that, it's a world that is increasingly hostile. So they have to navigate their companies through very choppy waters without, I think, the mentality or indeed experience for it. And that is that I don't envy them.
I think that's true. I would say that has varied between countries. I don't think that German industry has ever forgotten that it is German. They have always had that to it, and indeed they have a close relationship with the state that was in this process symbiotic. In navigating these waters, we will see how companies emerge and react and respond. The IRA has been fascinating to watch. I don't think it's a negative that companies are being forced to split production if that is entrenching them more firmly in an alliance. If a South Korean company chooses to produce partly in South Korea and partly in the United States, that's not only good for the US, it's also in some ways good for South Korea in that it is taking a bigger share of US production. It is making that alliance tighter and stronger. So there's a number of trade-offs within the IRA. It's not for US companies, it's for US manufacturing, and that position is, I think, an interesting one. All right, go ahead.
Can I just add one more thing about executives' mentality? So Helmut Schmidt tells who everybody on this call knows by name, told in an interview and has written about it as well, or wrote about it while he was still alive, a really fascinating story about a planned acquisition of a chunk of Mercedes-Benz. And this was in 1977 or early 78. And it was the government of Iran that wanted to buy a stake in Mercedes-Benz. And Helmut Schmidt said to himself, and he recounts this in this interview. He said, "I said to myself, this can't be allowed to happen. The Ayatollah is waiting in Paris to come back to Iran. It can't be that the crown jewel of German manufacturing is owned by a revolutionary government. So what did he do? And then he continues to tell the story. He picked up the phone and called Deutsche Bank, which at that point was led by Alfred Herrhausen, who was subsequently killed by the Red Army faction. But anyway, at that point, he still led Deutsche Bank. And he picked up the phone and asked Deutsche Bank to buy this stake in Mercedes-Benz. And he said, you may not make an immediate profit, and you may never make a profit from this stake, but it's your patriotic duty to buy this stake. And Deutsche Bank did. And I always wonder if Olaf Scholz, if Rishi Sunak, if Joe Biden were to call the equivalent banking executive, banking boss today, and ask them to buy a stake in a crucial company, would they do it? And I think that may be a question for the group to discuss afterwards. But I wonder, would they do it?
I think it's a really interesting frame of reference. I'm conscious we have we're running out of time, so if people want to ask questions, ask now or forever hold your peace. One follow-up on this really is what a fundamental question that I think underpins your book, and it's something Brandon has raised and that I think is really important, is what was the trigger for this process? Was the trigger China and Russia disregarding the rules? We haven't actually talked as much about Russia as I was expecting. Was it the rule breaking of states, or was it the economic effect of globalization that triggered the process you describe, and particularly the change in political thinking, particularly in Europe and the US? So Brandon, what was the first trigger? And this is maybe a chicken and egg conversation, but
I think it was several triggers at the same time. The first one was domestic in the West, that the people who were disaffected got a voice, but that was separate from any sort of process that took place in Russia and China. I think one process on Russia in particular, the process that took place there was that Putin decided that the time had come where he was going to execute his top priority, which was never increased prosperity at all costs. It was geopolitical. So that's the lines along which he started thinking. And for me, a pivotal moment arrived when Mike Calvi was arrested. I don't know if everybody on this call knows who Mike Calvi is, but I won't take a show of hands because we don't have the pictures up, but or the video up. But Mike Calvi is an American investor, was one of the first equity investors in Russia in the early 90s, incredibly successful, and remained there, kept investing. When Russia annexed Crimea, Mike, who lived part-time in London, and that's how I know him, he kept investing, kept saying, well, look, it's Crimea happened, but it's still safe to invest in Russia. Look at me, I'm still here. Then in 2019, he was arrested and put under house arrest. And in 2021, he went on trial. It was a very lengthy trial, and the case involved, essentially, it was a business dispute with a crony of Putin, and inevitably, Mike, after a very lengthy trial, was convicted, even though it was a very flimsy case. And that's when I think it became clear that the Russian government's top priority was not playing nicely as part of a globalized world. It was something else altogether. And then with China, we saw, I think, already starting with the global financial crisis, that's when the Chinese leadership and indeed business people starting saying, well, hang on, what is this US-led global system, global financial system, and by extension, global economic system that gets us all into such big trouble? Now we are going to make sure that we don't catch this cold again. And I think that's when they really started cooling on this whole idea. And then, of course, we saw the rise of Xi Jinping in subsequent years. It was completely different factors that came together in really in the around 2018, 2019 to create this collective loss of faith in the globalized system, even though these different actors have never met and never will.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our discussions, which have been fascinating and I hope as enjoyable for the audience as I have found them. I suppose a final question is about the possibility and viability of the concept of bifurcation, which is something you talk about in the book. And one of the things I've written about a bit is that in times like those we're going through now, neutral states don't face binary choices. They can foot drag, they can trade with both sides. Indeed, the whole concept of neutrality was invented in actually the Baltic Sea region, funnily enough, geopolitically, to facilitate trade through blockade, to facilitate trade between different sides. So is the world we're entering, the world you describe, one that is bifurcated or one that is diverse and very, very, very complex? Some people use the word multipolar, an awful lot of poles. My own tendency, and I've written about this a little bit, is towards the latter. But what would be your position on that?
It's a world that will have to be, that will be inevitably heading towards two trading blocks, but that doesn't mean two hegemonic blocks of the kind we saw during the Cold War, or indeed have seen during previous eras, because it will just be about trade, which is why I think the West has an opportunity. We don't need to win over everybody to our way of life. We just need to trade with them and not try to engage in this all-embracing romance that we thought that we engaged in with the rest of the world in the 90s. We just need to trade with countries, and so while they may take different positions on foreign policy, different to our own, we can still trade with them, right? And that also means I think we have to give up a little bit on the sort of lecturing that we tend to engage in on matters of foreign policy and human rights. We may think that it's our right to express our views to other countries, but if we want to trade with them, then we can't lecture them about how to conduct other parts of their policy. And so India, since you mentioned India, Hugo, it will be, I think, a crucial prize in this tug of war between us and the emerging bloc led by China, with Russia as its sidekick. And we can't lecture India about what foreign policy positions to take, as long as they're willing to trade on an honest and productive basis with us. The same thing is true for countries in the Middle East. And the irony of globalization is that these past 35, 40 years have made many countries very wealthy, and as a result has allowed them to have a stronger voice in foreign and security policy. So whereas 40 years ago, we, the West, could tell some countries, quite a few countries around the world, you could diplomatically, quietly tell them that they might like to take a certain position. Now, many of those countries are very confident in their own ability to take positions and are not going to listen to us, but we need them in this, I think, more realistic trading setup that we will have to create. And then I hope at some points that setup can expand into a new round of globalization.
All right. Elisabeth, thank you so very much for your time. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. This is the sales part of the afternoon. So we are now going to put up a QR code that will give you a discount on Goodbye Globalization, which I'm going to kind of wave at you again as an encouragement to purchase. I hope everyone's enjoyed the afternoon. Elisabeth, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.